Hello and welcome to episode 36 of the Wilder Podcast. In this episode, we chat with Emily and Alex, the co-founders of Grazing Management. We discuss what conservation grazing is, why it's so important for biodiversity, and how they are managing to make it into a successful business. Chloe, hello.
Hello, Tom.
Happy Friday evening. This is the first opportunity we've got to update the podcast and get another episode out. So we're grabbing it with both hands, aren't we?
We are. We're excited to be recording again. It's been a while. Sorry, listeners. There's been a lot going on.
Despite a great interview we've got coming up, especially not just because Alex is ex-military and, we ex-military stuff, but we do always do a little update on who we are and what we've been up to. So which one would you like to do? Give the update or give who we are?
I did the who we are last time, so you can go for it.
Okay, so we are Chloe and Tom, husband and wife. We've been running the Grange Project for now about 2 years, and this podcast has been going alongside it. And essentially, we started that journey with zero knowledge in biodiversity, climate change, rewilding, nature recovery, and we are educating ourselves as we go through this journey, as we're implementing what we're learning on our project, and also trying to show that you can generate recurring revenue and businesses that help support the wider purpose of the project, which is
the Grange charity, where we're supporting young people to increase nature connectivity.
Get them out from wherever they are, from behind the screens, from the inner cities, get them out into wilder nature and get their hands dirty and stuck in. As always, we haven't started an episode off with an apology, but we may as well. During the last episode, which, by the way, if you haven't listened to, it's a really good overview of where we are with the project. We've gone through pretty much everything that's happened over the last 6 months. We forgot to mention a fairly substantial structure, didn't we?
And what has been taking up a lot of our time over the last few weeks and months in terms of project managing and trying to get this facility to be the best it can possibly be for the project. So we're excited to say that the Grange Hub is nearing completion.
And for anyone that's not sure what the Grange Hub is, we've got 5 fairly large modern barns on the project. And so one of them is being converted into a pretty swanky education place,
communal area for our ecotourism guests,
co-working space,
hosting corporate away days,
gin tasting facility,
community events,
and other stuff I'm sure we haven't yet thought of. But it's got so much utility in it. It's really exciting. They're even starting to put the cladding on the outside. It's starting to look like it's going to look like when it's finished.
It's that really exciting step in the journey where you can actually visualize what the final space is going to be like now. Like all the window openings are in, the floor is in. You kind of get a sense of how it locates itself in the whole project, and the views and the situation are pretty special.
Yeah, I mean, the location is like you're being hugged by nature, which is kind of the point. Chloe, can you give us an update on the most recent community day?
I think it's fair to say we were both feeling a little trepidatious prior to the day because we had the most sign-ups we've ever had, which is fantastic. But it was also supposed to be a fairly soggy day in February. So we were slightly uncertain about how the day went, but I would say fueled by tea, cake and a lot of enthusiasm, we waded through significant amounts of Welsh mud to achieve a huge amount in the day.
Yeah, 3 hedge lines laid?
3 hedge lines, orchard planted.
And brush piles created. And one of the many things I really enjoyed about that day was the breadth of people, the diversity, the age differences, the backgrounds. It was all eclectic in a really wonderful mosaic kind of way, you might say.
One of my favourite things about these days now is we have our regulars who come every time, and they're friends now. It's so lovely to see people come back, for them to appreciate how the landscape's changed since the last community day, and for us to pick up conversations from where we left off last time that we were together, as well as welcoming new faces and people that have found us through all sorts of diverse routes and places. And it's just such a joy to find out everyone's story.
So finally, 2 shout outs really. The first one to Steve Mason and Martin Hayes. They really led on the orchard. They made sure that everything was done to the right level of detail to make sure that these saplings are going to really thrive and become key asset to the project.
And it's so lovely because it's given a space that was a slightly dead space behind the modern barns, a real identity of the orchard. And Martin gave a fantastic talk during the lunchtime, which really helped us understand the biodiversity benefits of orchards and just how you can create your own orchard spaces in your own garden, which was really appreciated.
I did not know there was that much to learn about orchards. I felt very underprepared to be a orchard parent.
I was sitting there taking notes, it's all right.
And the second shout out is for Phil Staunton, who pioneered the designed for the Staunton Brash Pile, which essentially is a small mammal hotel where we've created loads of different layers. We then turned it into this warm, cozy space and then planted around them all the different berries and bushes that they might like to feast on in order to increase the population.
The patent is pending.
It is. Thank you, everyone, for taking part, and really hope to welcome you back in the near future. Chloe, do you mind if I have one last request from the listener before we go into the interview?
Please do.
So, regular visitors and also the people of the podcast will know that I'm very proud of my scrapes that I've been digging into the ground over the last 2 years, and they've been doing very well. But this year, they've been already inundated with algae, covering 50% of the scrapes already, and it's just getting worse, which is the beginning of March. So if anyone has any thoughts on how best to manage that, I really would appreciate any emails you can send in. Just hello@grangeproject.co.uk and help me out.
Yeah, the pride Tom takes in his ponds and scrapes are second only to the love for the pigs. So it shows how important they are for the project and for him.
It's true.
So on that note, shall we move into our interview with Emily and Alex?
Let's do it.
What I really appreciated about this conversation was the balance between the warmth and the humour around the kitchen table, the technical discussion, and the practical realities of running a conservation grazing business.
Their passion came through. It was just radiating off them. And as you're listening, you'll just find yourself smiling. So should we get into it?
Let's do that. So it's a pleasure to be recording a podcast in a slightly different location today. We're actually sat around the farmhouse kitchen with Emily and Alex here, and welcome both to the World of Podcast.
Hi, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having us.
Today we're going to be having a conversation around the role of herbivores really in managing land, and that's obviously a critical part of a lot of rewilding projects, and I'm really interested to get stuck into a conversation with some experts about the role they play for both land management and biodiversity. But before we get into that, I'm wondering if you could introduce yourselves and Grazing Management.
Well, thanks for coming. I'm Emily and this is Alex.
Hello.
So we run a business called Grazing Management. We are a specialist conservation grazier and use cattle, goats and sheep as part of nature restoration projects across Forest of Dean and Monmouthshire mainly.
It's a business we sort of started with the idea of it in 2017 when we could see the need for nature restoration and seemed to be a bit of a gap in people who could provide that specialist nature-focused grazing, with the key outcome being the environmental and biodiversity aim, as opposed to the food production. So we set it up where food production's an aside. It's been quite a journey to get here, a few career changes along the way, but it's been really interesting to be able to use skills learnt in other backgrounds to then come at this quite important problem, but with a different perspective, I think, and bring in a lot of cross-sector views. So it's been really fascinating to see how you can take stuff from completely different environments and apply it for helping to restore nature.
Well, that's it. And I just want to touch on your guys' backgrounds because it's, again, coming from different sectors. And I think that's echoes a lot in what Chloe and I have done. So where have you come from and what inspired you to switch careers?
My background is in environmental management and charities. I've been working in food and farming charities and nature education most recently. So I was really excited to get back into a more hands-on role where you can really see that difference that you're making. So the part of the business that I'm particularly excited about is how we bring people into this whole journey and how our volunteers and students get an opportunity to work with animals and understand the role that they have in these sites and really how communities can take ownership of these projects.
I suppose how I got here, one of my previous careers was in the military in the Gurkhas. We were based out in Borneo for quite a while there. And there was a moment when Em and I decided for New Year we're going to fly up into the Kalimantan Highlands in the middle of Borneo. And we got in this little prop plane and flew up. And it was just astounding to see beautiful primary rainforest, 40 meters up, all the way along the Brunei border. And then just this cliff edge. And then it just hit palm oil plantations. And from a plane, you can see so far. And it was just this rigid pattern of palm oil as far as we could see. We were flying for quite a few miles. It was so stark that that wasn't the climate, it wasn't soils, that was human intervention, 100%. You couldn't doubt that. You can't make an excuse on that. And it really struck me as to what we were doing there. And it made me want to do something about it. And then fast forward a few years, and I worked in the Foreign Office and spent a lot of time out in the Middle East. And I was working out in Jordan, where our 2 girls were born. And we went out to visit a nature reserve out there as well with an oryx project. And there was this chain link fence that went around the edge. And on the inside of it was sort of still deserty savanna, but it was a sort of chest-high green covering everywhere, and then it hit the chain link fence and it just stopped, and it was just dust and pebbles. And you could then see the goat herders disappearing off into the distance. And it was that human impact. That, again, that's not soil, that's not climate, that's not geology. That is humans that have made that happen. And that part of Jordan, you go out to the old hunting lodges, and they've got pictures of rhinos and giraffes and things, because that part of Jordan was a savanna in effect. And then it was just turned into desert and hunted out. And this isn't a criticism of other cultures and countries, because look at what we've done in the UK. But it was really stark seeing it overseas in those contexts. So that really brought it home. And I think then those skills that I learned from the military in terms of planning and assessing risk were quite useful in how to deliver something on the ground and deal with the uncertainties around it, and some of the hard physical graft outside. And then in the Foreign Office, the kind of work I did, we used a lot of technological innovations. So we used the example of when I was working up on the Syrian border, we had a geofencing technology then, and we were using it to keep us safe so that if we got kidnapped, an alert would be sent, and we could use that technology. Fast forward to 2017, and I had a belly full of conflict zones and had to take a change, looking at farming, but with a nature conservation focus. And then I saw things like no fence, which we'll probably talk about. And at that point, it was just a concept. But I've used this for real in a completely different concept, a completely different arena. It was to stop me getting kidnapped by terrorists in Syria. But I know this works. I've seen it. So I can understand how we might then be able to apply it. And things like that allowed us to be early adopters. And then things like doing the masters in cyberspace operations that my old work put me through. It's just opened a whole new world of technologies to me to think, okay, we could use that. I'm not a techie, but I do think it's fascinating what we could do with it. So you sort of take those bits and you put them across a passion for nature and conservation. And I don't know, it's quite exciting.
I mean, my question there is just back on your experience. You could have gone down a very conventional farming route. So is it basically you're used to taking risks, you want to do things a bit differently, and you're mashing together that technological know-how, and you've gone, actually, this is where we can form our niche and have a positive impact? I just come trying to understand why you decided to go on the side of doing things that other people aren't doing.
I think it was a bit of a case of necessity being the mother of invention. Trying to buy land, as anyone who's tried it knows, pretty well impossible unless you've got a huge amount of money in the bank. So we started out really small, and for us, the grazier model was a much better way in, and using the technology meant it was more viable than it would otherwise have been. There's not a lot of fences in a lot of the places we graze, so the no fence technology made a lot of sense with that. The other technology we've started to weave in as well has allowed that growth and that ability to monitor and care for animals over a much larger area. I think also coming from completely different sectors and outside, we were looking for something that would combine both of our interests and our passions. And if we were going to go into this as a family, it needed to be something we were all excited about. And I think this combination of nature and people and high quality food production was something that we were both so excited about.
I think when I came back from those conflict zones, it was working with the animals that really struck me. It really helped focus the mind after some pretty strong experiences, I think it'd be fair to say. And I don't want to criticise farmers, I'm always very careful, but the way that a lot of intensive agriculture is done just didn't sit with my personal approach to how I wanted to do it. And also, financially, it doesn't really stack up from what I see. Every time I read reports, there's one recently that looked at the best 25%, the top 25% beef and sheep farmers in the country, and what they were doing differently and how they were making it work. But you dig into the numbers on that and you look at it and go, hang on, once you take the subsidies out, they're only earning £14,000 a year. That is, for how hard I know they're working to make that happen, it's just ridiculous. So it was also, there's a financial element to it as well, of why would we try and keep replicating a system that obviously doesn't work apart from government subsidies, and those government subsidies are going. So that was one part. But as you say, fundamentally, it's because we care about nature. It's what gets us out of bed every morning, isn't it? It needs to stack up. It needs to be a viable business model. Otherwise, we won't be able to do the work for nature. But it was that as new entrants getting access to land, having a viable business model, doing something we're just deeply passionate about. And we love it because our girls are involved. And all the communities of volunteers that we work with, it just makes it awesome. We're not a lonely farmer sitting on a farm and the tractor doing things. We're out with people all the time, engaging with people. The animals are just part of the story. And I think we both love that part.
There's so many echoes in our story, and even just sat here in the farmhouse, I'm looking out and we're surrounded by woodland here in the Forest of Dean, and it really feels like nature is on the doorstep. And I can really imagine you guys here of an evening, similar to us, the kids are in bed and you're planning the next step in the journey. And you know, what a privilege that is. But I wonder if we could take it right back to basics, because you mentioned there around intensive farming. And I think perhaps from a nature conservation or environmental perspective, people would often have critiques of grazing animals in terms of the intensity of grazing and the damage that does to the landscape. So it'd be great to kind of give us the basic foundational answer to the question of why are grazing cattle and sheep and goats important for the management of habitat?
I'm very much an adherent of the Franzavera view of sort of Western Europe being more of a temperate savanna, or wet, boggy, muddy and drizzly, rather than beautiful Kenyan. But that role of large herbivores being so crucial, and we see it, we were talking earlier about the difference between the sheep grazed fields and the cattle grazed fields in the way that the cattle can leave, you know, a 3-1-1 ratio, 3 parts short graze, 1 part long tussocky elements, which are great invertebrate overwintering sites, and then sort of 1 part trampled, slightly poached, creating these sort of amphibian corridors of the small pools of water across a field, and sort of punching through that rhizomic mat of the grasses to allow the wildflowers to then come through. And that's really difficult to replicate with a machine. But you can then also put all your cattle inside a shed. You can put a really intensive ryegrass clover lay on a field, cover it in fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides, cut it 4 times a year, put it all in a silage clamp, feed your animals, get loads and loads of beef. It'll cost you loads of money to do it as well, though, and you probably won't make any profit, but you will produce a lot of beef, and you'll have very little nature benefit from it. I always talk about the how, not the cow. With cattle, you can do some incredible work to replicate these natural processes. The dung from them is just an incredible source of food for the whole of the trophic cascade. All the insect life that sits within it that then feeds the bats and the birds, which can then be, the raptors can then feed off those. We see a lot of mammals will scratch away at the live dung piles, which is really important. So we know that all of those are then feeding off of that. And then also the carbon sequestration part of it. If you've got dung beetles that are busy burying all that stuff deep in the ground, building those thick, deep soils like you see on the the plains in Ukraine and Western America before they all get blown away by intensive agriculture. I just find it fascinating that cattle, in my view, can be an incredible way of building soil, storing carbon, building biodiversity, feeding people nutrient-dense food, but they can also be really terrible, and it really depends on how you do it rather than the animal itself being bad.
I think it's really important to dwell on that point, because for Tom and I, even 2 years ago, grass was kind of just grass. So whether you were talking about a ryegrass clover lay, or whether you were talking about the landscape you're discussing, the short, the tussocky, the trampled, and the kind of habitat that provides. So I wonder if we could just dwell on that point a bit and talk about what are the differences between these 2 types of habitat and what are the benefits for each for biodiversity.
Also, for the thickie in the room, can you explain what a trophic cascade is?
So trophic cascade, think of it like a pyramid, and at the bottom would be your plants, and then going up would be the animals that rely on those plants, and it would be the animals that rely on eating those animals that have been eating the plants. It's a very simplistic way of putting it, but it can be much more complicated than that, and potentially more of a web than a pyramid. If that base is really wide, so if you think with a ryegrass clover, very intensive agriculturally productive grassland, you've only got 2 species in there. Whereas if you have a species-rich grassland, you can have 50 different species potentially, which creates so many more niches for so many more different animals that have relied on them. When you look at the butterflies, for example, there'll be a nursery plant for the caterpillars that they need to eat, and then there's the nectar sources that the adult butterflies will need. But you need those 2 to be there, and each different species has developed a niche for those different ones. So having that variety gives you a different variety of butterflies. That gives you more resilience, because there'll be some years when some species do well and others won't. And then that gives more resilience further up this trophic cascade, that then there's more species that are available for more animals to eat further up. And the whole thing works, especially when we talk about changes to climate, that in some years some plants will do really well, and in other years some are going to do really badly. You spread your risk. If you've got 50 different species going, some are going to thrive and some won't. If you've only got 2 species, there's a reasonable chance you're going to end up with a drought situation, especially if you've got shallow rooting plants, for example. So having a mixture of shallow rooting, deep rooting, ones that are nitrogen fixing, ones that don't need nitrogen, it just, to me, I'm not a gambling man, right? I would want to spread across as much of the risks as possible.
Another stupid question. Why do farmers only want 2 different types? So what's the benefit to them versus having 50? Because again, to me, being completely naive here, of course it makes all the sense to have the diversity.
So ryegrass is full of energy, lots of calories in it. It grows really well, really quickly. So it gives your animals that energy to grow really big, really quickly. Clover is full of protein, and that grows your animals really well to bulk them up. So it's sort of like a bodybuilder diet of just high calorie, high protein. So it works really, really well, but it leaves you vulnerable at the same time. The issue with the species-rich grassland, and why it's much less productive and you're getting a lot less meat, I would argue, is you get a lot less energy from it, you get a lot less protein from it, and you get just a lot less volume and bulk from it. So the amount of kilograms of meat per acre you can produce off species-rich grassland is much, much more reduced than it would be off ryegrass and clover, but you don't have to put as much into it. So you're not needing to reseed it constantly, you're not having to put fertilizers into it. And then the other part of the management side is how you do it. So if you're cutting that ryegrass clover field 4 times a year, you're never getting those long tusky swards for invertebrates. You're never creating that chance for habitat. You're not creating the seed source because you don't want it to go to seed. Once it goes to seed, the plant stops growing in its vegetative state as much. So what you really want, if for high productivity, you're trying to sort of cut the grass just before it hits seed state, because once it's done that, it's a lot slower to regrow and it starts going stalky, it's less digestible for the animals. The best for biodiversity, I would argue, would be let that species-rich grassland grow really long, create all that habitat, but once it then starts dying off and it gets stalky, the animals don't want to eat as much. Then what they are eating is less digestible, and it has less energy, and it has less protein in it. So you get this sort of quadruple whammy of less productivity with it, but you get huge biodiversity gains. It's just incomparable between the two systems. And the cattle are, I said it's the how, not the cow. I'll probably keep saying that over and over again, and you'll get really bored of me saying that. But cattle can be phenomenal, and also you can just negate all the benefits at the same time, I would argue. But you'll produce a lot of cheap food for people, and it's a really difficult debate, I think, when we talk about cost of living crisis, and we're aware that we're privileged that we can afford to buy food and we don't need to go to a food bank. And so what does that mean for other people? And then also around the world, where you've got plenty of people that are now coming into a middle class that want to be able to have meat in their diets, which haven't been able to access that before. So how do we balance that from a position of privilege to criticize other people wanting cheap food?
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole podcast in itself in the making. My last stupid question, and I'll pass the mic.
Those stupid questions here.
Oh, yeah, no, there are. I seem to remember someone telling me that if livestock have a more diverse diet, then they're less likely to become ill and require veterinary inputs. Is that another positive of having more diversity versus a kind of monoculture crop?
I think we would see that. I know when I worked on a calf rearing project where we were trying to take commercial dairy bull calves and feed them up, we were very intensively feeding them with a high grain based diet, and the number of losses, the number of illnesses, deaths was horrific, really. I hated it. And then not just on the sort of moral ethical side, there was just a huge amount of extra labour and cost involved, which made the profitability really difficult on it. But it was providing cheap food for people, and again, I understood what we were doing and why we were doing it, and we were trying to reduce antibiotic use, and we were trying to find a use for these animals that could otherwise be culled at birth, which is really sad in the industry. Whereas, one of my favourite stories, one of the first farms I worked on, they had some longhorn cattle, and he would talk about how he would see his cattle go and find the willow trees, eat that, and then go and eat the nettles. And his theory was that they were using the salicylic acid in the willow, aspirin, to basically numb their tongues before they ate the nettles, and they knew that there were certain nutrients they needed in the nettles, and they could self-medicate. The Welsh farms always used to have a hospital field. There'd be an acre or two, and that would be the field when they had a sick animal to put it in, and they'd let them choose what they wanted to eat. And I always think of it like when you were pregnant, you knew your body cravings. Or when I was in Afghanistan on ration packs, I knew my body wasn't craving a steak or a lobster. It wanted salad. I mean, that's one of the few times in my life I ever wanted an iceberg lettuce. But my body knew that it needed those nutrients. And the cattle are the same. They will, when we give them the sites they've got, they will choose and browse.
One story on that one is similar, echo that when I was on exercise in the military, when the guy brings out, after you've been on exercise for 5 days or whatever it is, and you've got an apple there. I've never seen a group of blokes turn on somebody so much when they see that apple. But anyway, sorry, keep going.
The other thing, again, I'm going to say it again, the how, not the cow, and you can do a count and find me at the end. But the big thing for us is not using these ivermectins, these chemical wormers in the cattle, because then the dung comes out, the insects are attracted to it, and it basically kills them. It's like a poisoned well. So for us, using natural anthelmintics, because in nature there's plenty of high tannin plants that will naturally kill off the worms in the animals. So we focus on that diversity of plants that have got the high tannins, so we don't need to use the wormers, so that the dung is a real profile. I have to say, we talk about Dawn. Emily does all our Instagram, and the most popular from all the hard work and creativity that she's put in is a picture of a cow pat covered in dung beetles. By far the most views. And do we just need to do more cow poo?
So I think that's really helpfully laid the context about why grazing cattle are important and the role they can play in increasing biodiversity. It'd be lovely to hear a little bit more about the journey of setting up grazing management and kind of what do the operations look like on a day-to-day basis for you both.
So we started the business about 4 years ago now, very, very part-time. We were both doing other jobs as well until very recently. We started off just with some sheep. Alex has spoken a lot about cattle. We think sheep and goats are also brilliant for grazing if managed in the right way. We can come back to that more later if you'd like. But they obviously all graze in really different ways. We started out with sheep because I think if you're starting out with livestock, they're a less intimidating place to start than cats.
Yeah.
And started just with some neighbours, small fields, sort of built a bit of credibility around what we were doing and that we were reliable. And from there, we're very fortunate to get some funding from Severn Trent through their Boost for Biodiversity scheme. That gave us the funding to get started, alongside some other amazing funders who we should probably mention. The Forest of Dean District Council gave us a startup business grant, Dean Meadows Group. And so we found a lot of really supportive, helpful people on the way to get us started. I think people could see that we were fairly obsessive about what we were doing and really excited about it. So we started off then with 6 lovely traditional Hereford cattle. It was a steep learning curve. It was a lot of shopping for kit and building ourselves a yard at home, which was a long labour of love. From there, we started grazing a lot of sites in our local area. So what would have been traditional small fields, which, because they're not properly fenced or with proper water, had sort of become less good for wildflowers than previously they would have been. So there was a lot of bracken and brambles taking over, which we were fighting against. We started a fairly large project down on the River Wye near Brockwere, where the cattle were munching their way through Himalayan balsam, which was brilliant.
Nice.
It's a really, really tricky site to manage from a human point of view because of the tidal nature of it. Trying to get volunteers down onto the banks is currently incredibly dangerous, and you need to have the Sara lifeboat on the river in case anyone falls in. So to have the cattle doing that just felt like win-win.
Yeah.
They loved the balsam. It must taste amazing. They would smash through the bracken to get to it. So it was a really, really good sort of first project. We learned a lot about public access and signage and how you can manage that interaction between a really busy footpath. So we've got the Offa's Dyke footpath running through there. So we learned a lot from that project. We then started working with some more institutional landowners. So we work with Natural Resources Wales on a heathland restoration project. And that is a project where they'd spend a huge amount of money cutting trees back, trying to restore it to a heathland site. It's a really important site for nightjars and for adders, and it was just getting completely crowded out by tree regrowth. So the cattle would come in after they've been cutting to make sure it doesn't all just grow back. So we're there as that sort of second wave of once some of the mechanical work, some of those operations have been undertaken that we can put the cattle in. We've got a phenomenal volunteer group up there. So we've got a lot of people who live locally who are out on these sites every day walking dogs and out for exercise anyway, who will send us daily photos of the animals. So they've really become a great project. We work with the Wye Valley National Landscape on a peat bog restoration project where we've got the cattle slopping around in the bog, again, sort of like eating all the plants that would be drying the bog out and causing that massive carbon release that happens when peat bog is damaged. So yeah, it's just been a case of sort of slowly chipping away at loads of different types of habitat, loads of different partnerships, and just sort of building our expertise and our credibility and our networks. We both went full-time on the business in the summer, which has been quite transformational. We employ 2 people now and just took on a student placement, a trainee of our own, which feels that we've come full circle from the wide-eyed newbies to actually having a trainee as well.
I wish the listener could just see how happy Emily is when she's talking about these things. It's nice to see your guys' passion about what you're doing.
I was preparing for a presentation last night and just doing some stats. If you're interested in some stats,
Lots of stats.
Here it's so we've now got 2 volunteer groups, about to be a 3rd volunteer group. We've got 11 institutional partners across charities, public bodies, private companies. We've got 16 different landowners we're working with, 25 different sites, 450 acres, but that's always growing. We've got now 80 animals involved, up from the 6 or so we started with, and the sites are across 1,400 square miles.
That's what I call a humble brag. That's great. No, it's over 4 years. That's
Just
amazing.
flexing there.
Yeah.
It also sounds very logistically complicated.
I love that that's what you need to go away from that.
Oh, it's a huge headache. Absolutely. So I guess it'd be good to hear a bit more about the time management side of that, and also maybe connected back into the point you made at the start, Alex, about how do you keep them where you want them to be?
Yeah, it's an ongoing headache, and animals have got this really uncanny sixth sense for when you need to be somewhere and get something done, and that is absolutely the moment they'll escape or get ill or something. And so, of course, we are always putting the animals first, but sometimes at 10 o'clock on a Sunday night when you've just got the kids to bed and then something, you get a notification on your phone that you need to go out and deal with something. It's not always ideal, but, that's the, ups and downs of every job. So yeah, we use no fence geo collars, which are a GPS-based collar-based system. So it's a wearable piece of tech that the animal has around its neck. You draw a little boundary on your phone on the app that uploads to the collar, and then that is your fence. So we tend to prefer to have a physical fence as well if there's a fast road or something. But for being able to keep the animals where they need to be, to send us all that tracking data, loads of really useful information about if animals aren't moving as much as they should be. All of that data comes through the app, which is brilliant. The collars beep at the cow or the goat when they get near the edge of the boundary, and really quickly they learn that the beep means turn around and go the other way.
Because if not, it would get a shock.
So they get a small electric shock if they go beyond the warnings. But they learn it really quickly. The system isn't perfect. I think we would like to be honest about that. We deal with a lot of tech issues with the system, but it has allowed us to be in places that otherwise would be impossible. We've got goats on one project about an hour and a half away, get grazing on this mad cliff face, and being able to really target where they are and not on the massively endangered special mosses and on other areas, it really kind of creates an interesting niche for us as a business.
It is cool because I've seen the app, you guys have shown me the app, and you can not only have the external barrier, but you can have internal areas you want to keep them off as well, which I think is really powerful, especially when we're talking about conservation special areas. If it was just me, I would have because I'm a techie geek, I'd have a wall full of monitors with each of my sites, because you can see where each individual cow or goat or sheep is, and I've become quite obsessive about it.
It's an absolute tech wormhole. You can lose yourself for hours in going through oh look, this one's moved 5% less than it did yesterday, we should go and check it. It's too much data.
I have to remember every morning to say, "Morning, darling, love you," before I reach my phone and check where all the animals are on the app. The no cows in the bedroom chats rule that we have to have doesn't necessarily get adhered to all the time. On the time management side, the tech is very helpful, but it is still the people. So the volunteers are brilliant. They will often flag an issue for us. They are able to do the checks for us. It saves us a lot of diesel and time, but also they get to really know the animals and are advocates for us. But then we've got a great team. Paula, who works for us, there was a call at 2 a.m. some cattle had got out, and she just went and dealt without even calling us and just made it happen for us. We had an animal that was loose, and she was up at 6 a.m. to go and deal with it. And building that strong team and working together is also really important to make this viable, I think, and we're really lucky with some of the people we've got.
With the no fence collars, because I have heard a critique that it can make less opportunity for interaction with the animals because you're not spending as much time around them, because you don't have to do this kind of daily checks, because you can use the app to monitor those movements. And I wonder whether or not, how do you maintain that relationship with them? And it sounds like the volunteers are a big part of that, but are you having to check them still on a daily basis? Is it more like once a week when they're up on a cliff top or down by a riverbank? Or
Yeah, I think it just helps us target where we spend the time, because we can't be across. Sorry, I spit him outside again.
No, it's all right. Fine. Very well, Tess.
You need heavy breathing.
For the purposes of the audio reporting, TJ the dog has tried to come in, but then couldn't stop breathing heavily. So then TJ has now gone outside, and now he's barking. So I think we're just going to accept the wonderful ambience that he's providing to the backdrop to this conversation.
We were talking about maintaining that sort of bond with the animals when you don't have to be out with them every day. I think we use the tech in a slightly different way, actually, that we use it to really kind of prioritize which sites need our attention. And it means that when we get to a site, we can spend much longer on one site rather than trying to tick off everything in one day. So it's really important to us that the animals know us and will follow a bucket and will politely get into a trailer at the end of a grazing job. So it's really important that we do keep that connection, and you're absolutely right. There's that risk that you could just do this all remotely. They would be completely wild, which for some projects probably would be great if you're talking about extensive rewilding projects. For us, these guys need to be as tame as a dog. Need to come when you rattle a bucket, walk into a trailer, and sort of let people sort of interact with them in a really calm, quiet way. So,
but I mean, what the positive sides, balance them out beautifully. The positives are you will know instantly if something has gone on walkies, whereas before you wouldn't have done. It would maybe been 12 hours, 24 hours before or if not longer, before you realise that. So there are obviously significantly increased benefits, I would argue, than the negatives suggest.
I remember that time we were doing the peat bulb restoration project for Wildflower National Landscapes, and we got the alert, and we tracked the animal that had got out. We turned up at this person's house, and they're like, "How did you know it was here? We haven't told anyone." So, because I've GPS tracked my cow to your house. He was like, "What?"
Don't make sure I word to the Foreign Office.
So you mentioned there about some of the mechanical work that happens on these sites, whether it's cutting down trees or hay cutting. And, when we first moved into the Grange Project, the feedback we had from the Monmouthshire Meadows group was actually that cutting the hay was going to be a really important part of our management strategy in order to create these species-rich grasslands. And it would be really great to hear a bit about some of the pros and cons of those different approaches and what cattle might bring, because I guess that's the approach we're considering, which is more in line with rewilding principles of having and conservation principles of having cattle to manage. But why would you pick that option and not just do your annual hay cut?
So one of the reasons for a hay cut would be that a lot of fields had fertilizer spread on them, and the problem with things like nitrogen, potassium and phosphorus is they persist in the soil for quite a long time, and they give grasses a very big competitive advantage. So this kind of work is often the opposite of farming. You're trying to strip the fertility out of the fields to make them less fertile, so you can then let the species-rich wildflowers thrive. So hay cutting is really good for stripping out those nutrients, taking it off. So there are some fields where I would thoroughly recommend doing that. What I would say is once you've got it into a state where it is nutrient poor and those wildflower species are thriving, you can still take hay off, and we will do a lot of aftermath grazing on some of the sites. The aftermath is after a hay cut. It's the residues that are left. You then graze it for the next few months while it grows back. But for me, the real biodiversity win is when you can leave it as a standing hay crop and to replicate nature. I mean, hay cutting is not a natural process. All those parts of that interconnected food web didn't evolve with hay meadows. They evolved with grasslands that were standing, that would then be grazed down by large animals, and all the interconnections that happen there. So for me, and this is where we're probably much more at the rewilding end than the farming end, I love seeing that. But it also has economic benefits for us. So on the 200-acre wildflower meadow restoration project we're doing with the Oldlands estate, it's really heavy clay soils, and people said you can't outwinter on that. It'll be impossible. Hold my beer and watch me. And we let the roots grow really long. We let the material grow long, and it's created a protective mat, in effect, that we can graze on there and then deliver the environmental benefits we want to, while also not having to have the animals inside barns, having to pay for straw, having to pay to muck them out, having to pay to bring feed to them. We don't have to do all that work and process because the animals have got the food in front of them. It's just lower productivity. So we'll produce less beef, but actually beef is a nice byproduct for us, a co-product. We're going to hit the environmental aims we want at the top level we possibly could, and do it in a way that would hopefully financially stacks up better than trying to do it in a commodity focused way.
So I noticed the temptation to step into a conversation about the revenue and business side, and I can hear Tom twitching next to me around that. But I just want to have a final point, which I hope won't be too technical for the listeners. But one of the things that I found really interesting in my developing understanding of the role that cattle play in grazing systems is the difference between conservation grazing, which as far as I understand is much more typical in a rewilding setup, the intensive grazing that you've touched on in terms of the particular lays and management practices associated with that. But there's this kind of middle ground of this concept called mob grazing. I think it'd be really interesting for listeners to have an understanding of what mob grazing is and what the differences are between that approach and what you're describing in terms of conservation grazing.
So mob grazing, to keep it succinct, is regularly moving a larger number of animals, a high density of animals, on small areas on a regular basis and then giving it longer rest periods. And this should improve the productivity of the vegetation growth. It should help build soil carbon with extra trampling, but it is focused on beef production, commodity production. And while I'm a big fan of it, I think if we're going to produce beef, then that's a really good way of doing it. But as I said, it's a middle ground. So you're losing some of the biodiversity elements of leaving that long stalky grass to overwinter, and you if you're coming back to graze it 60 days later, are you getting that full growth, that full habitat in a way that you would with a conservation grazing approach? And it's that intensity of grazing. But it is a good halfway house. I'm a big fan of it. Whereas conservation grazing, I think you get that full extent of the benefits.
And just to dwell on that a bit further, I think the thing that sometimes discombobulates me is around the kind of the number of cattle you're talking about with these different systems, because I know we've talked about lower productivity from a beef perspective, obviously much better for nature of the conservation grazing. But if you had I don't know, this might be an impossible question because it's probably so context dependent, but if you had like 50 acres, if you were doing your kind of intensive traditional, maybe traditional is the wrong word, but intensive system based on fossil fuel input and clover and ryegrass, if you had your mob grazing system, and then if you had your conservation grazing system, what numbers of cattle would you be talking about within each system?
You're going to have to do some very quick maths here. You might be looking at about 30 with the intensive. Some mob grazing advocates would say that you could look to replicate that by very careful management. And then on a conservation grazing side, I would be looking at probably closer to 10 year round on a site like that.
Really interesting. And I know I promised I'd only ask one last question before the end of it, but I'm going to throw another one in. Another stupid Tom question. From a really noddy perspective, as we went through our journey, Chloe and I've learned that cow's bad from a climate change perspective and the methane, etc. So how does that fit into, and I'm wondering if there's research or information around the amount of carbon they sequester doing conservation grazing versus they release, or is that the wrong question we should be asking? Actually, what's the biodiversity benefits versus not having them?
I think it's a really difficult one, the whole biodiversity versus carbon sort of debate. And what we've really tried to do is find that middle ground. I think the science is really complicated behind it. I had a lot of similar concerns about the sort of the justifiableness of the sort of methane production associated with the business that we're running. The science I have found has reassured me that it's a well-functioning grassland releases free radicals, which help break down the methane. And for a very, very low stocking density, such as we use, that's enough to offset the methane.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows how good that science is versus others. We try really hard to make sure things like fossil fuel use is as low as possible. So, for example, we're not doing all of those field processes and operations that we've talked about. But it's a really tricky one that we keep on wrestling with and keeping an eye on.
And I suppose the other side is it's if the cattle were doing it or the livestock you've got, what machinery would we be using in order to do that? So that's another interesting question.
I think maybe bring it onto a rewilding side. It's a fascinating report. I can't remember the author's name, which looked at pre-colonial continental USA and was looking at the number of ruminants, the herbivores there, before it all changed to farmland. And they estimated at the mid-range that there's something like 80% of the current numbers of ruminants were naturally there when you had these huge herds of buffalo there. All methane producing, they're all bovines. And then we sectioned it and we said, right, well, that's farmland and that's now grassland for cattle. And we've done it in a very intensive sort of managed way. But fundamentally, have we necessarily altered the number of grazing animals that are producing methane? And the world didn't blow up with huge herds of buffalo in continental USA or across the Great Plains of Africa. So part of me thinks that, okay, if you've got a stable number of cattle, and methane breaks down into carbon after a 10-year half-life, so if that carbon is then reabsorbed back into the plants that are growing and into the animal, if you look at methane production from cattle over a 100-year period, it's pretty much a stable flat line. But if we look at it in a 10-year period, it's a huge spike in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So I think it's a matter of perspective, and it's a matter of looking back over history and trying to understand where it fits in is how I look at it. And especially when we're doing it in such low intensity numbers for the amount of growth, vegetative growth that comes from what we're doing.
Yeah, it's fascinating one. Obviously, Chloe and I are talking about that, and that's why we're kind of reaching out to you guys as well, but everyone we speak to says you need these large grazing herbivores in order to do what they do best on your project in order to create biodiversity. So it's just 6 of one, half dozen of the other. And I think just keep an eye out for research and making information decisions based on what you find.
And I guess from the consumer perspective, because obviously the message is a lot, reduce your beef consumption. And on a general note, that's probably wise advice, but actually we would still eat beef that comes from a source like a rewilding project or that has been managed using conservation grazing principles. So we also want to support the businesses that are taking steps like you are to also protect the environment, with beef being a co-product of that process.
On that note, thank you, Chloe. Let's get back to, very briefly, right at the end now, but I know there'll be some people going, okay, cool, business, conservation grazing, helping biodiversity loss. How are you possibly, if you're not selling the beef or not doing it primarily to sell beef, how are you possibly making money? If you could succinctly answer that, and then we can close off this brilliant chat.
So it's a combination, really. We've got very sort of diversified income streams. The majority comes from contract payments, so that comes through the likes of the sort of the statutory bodies who've got those responsibilities for the sites and other funders. We do sell a small amount of beef, so animals that sort of reach the end of their time with us go to for local pubs, and a couple of sort of few rounds of boxed beef a year. We've started harvesting wildflower seed, which is a really exciting new venture. So on the Oldlands estate, they've got the most incredible seed bank there. So we are harvesting and working with them to start selling that. And then it's sort of building all those different layers.
And one of the things looking at the future here is, with the basic payments that farmers would get just for owning the land going, and now it's the public money for public goods approach. So I touched on it earlier about the reports, how it's so difficult for even for the commercial intensive farmers to make money from the beef. Is one of the things we're looking at is how we can help private landowners access the now really quite generous payments for the sort of species-rich grassland or wood pasture elements. And if we can be the people who deliver that for them and work in partnership with them, I think there's something that could work quite nicely to scale this up further, in the same way we've helped the public bodies where it's cost them a lot of money to do it mechanically, and we can provide a cheaper option, and I think just a much more interesting and engaging option by using the animals.
Thank you very much for your time. It's been really interesting and enlightening and fun to be here at your home. Is there anything or anywhere you'd like people to go to find out more about you if they'd like to?
Yes, please. We are on Instagram at Grazing Management. If anyone would like to see more cow videos, then you can shake a stick at.
Yes, please.
And goats and sheep. And our website is grazingmanagement.co.uk.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
I already want to go back to their table. I reckon they do a good dinner as well. If you go out, not I'm inviting myself back to their house for dinner, but I'm just saying. What I particularly liked, and it's something that I've been banging the drum about for a while, which is the importance of being from out of sector, bringing different knowledge and different experience and different technologies into a new area, new blood into it with a new passion. And it can only serve to drive forward positivity and change for the greater good. And that's just a great example of it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed hearing Alex's introductions. He talked about some of those significant moments on his journey. And at the time, you know, when he's out in Jordan or in Borneo, he probably wasn't making connections between that and what he wanted to achieve in the future. But when you look back, you can see all those little milestones that added up to grazing management, effectively. There's something about it being a shared experience that feels really important. How Emily and Alex draw on each other's strengths and weaknesses and drive it forward, and how the combination of all their shared experiences has resulted in something truly unique with grazing management. I think the energy you get from each other is a really important part of their journey.
And our journey.
I would agree.
I think it's one of the privileges of running a podcast is when you get guests on with different perspectives and different stories, and you hear different stories. You know, obviously the one that we heard prior to this conversation was cows are bad, don't need cows, let's replace them because they're causing climate change. And then when you scratch the surface, get someone who's got a certain amount of research and a lot of experience behind them, and you hear another perspective and you work through the logic of it, you're like, okay, no, there are different ways we could look at this. And that's what I really do enjoy about this podcast. I just get loads of perspectives and feel enriched by understanding things slightly better and knowing that now I need to go away and do more research. But that's a really positive thing. You now know what you don't know and you're moving on.
And I think it's fair to say that the science is still relatively young in these areas because it is complex, because systems are hard to predict, because there's lots of uncertainty that interacts with all the different variables. So it's not an easy thing to say, you know, a cow in this context is going to be net positive, a cow in this context is going to be net negative. I guess there's something about using your intuition and some of the logical steps that I think Alex and Emily explained so articulately in the podcast. And I think the exciting thing for us is that cows were always going to be part of the picture for the Grange Project. But, you know, maybe we feel a little bit informed about the why and the how of that.
interestingly, on a recent prep call for an interview, I spoke to a chief scientific officer for a rewilding project, and he was saying that actually pigs rootiling can actually be beneficial for climate change as well, which surprised me because they're disturbing soil, and I've heard that's bad. So I will ask him more when we get him on the podcast.
So much to learn.
Okay, well, hopefully, if you've got this far in the podcast, then you've enjoyed it and you've learned something. If you wouldn't mind, and if you've got time when this podcast comes to a close, it's just either stop what you're doing for 2 or 3 minutes and quickly just get onto your phone and give this podcast a rate and review on whatever platform you're on. It's really starting to creep up now, and it's starting to really set us apart from other podcasts that are around. And that just increases the popularity, increases the awareness of what we're discussing, gives us a nice warm fuzzy feeling and drive to keep going on with it, and hopefully allows other people to benefit from our experts that we get on.
Absolutely.
Is that all, Chloe?
That's all, Tom.
Let's go.